has specifically chosen you to be here at this time and in this place. You have incredible potential, purpose, and calling to push back the darkness and be a light for Christ. Stand for nothing and you'll fall for anything. It's time to stand your ground. This is Unapologetic. Hi everyone, welcome to Unapologetic. I'm so excited for another episode with Isabel Brown. She is a contributor at Turning Point. She has a brand new, amazing podcast, Outdated, and she also is the author of best-selling book, Frontlines, talking about her experience as a conservative, as a Christian on college campuses in America. I'm so excited to have Isabel with us today. We're going to discuss culture, spiritual war attack on America, and really how young people can lead the way in making a difference and making a change for our country, our churches, and ultimately our world. Thank you for being with us, Isabel.
Thanks for having me back for another episode. So fun.
I know. I'm so excited you're here. Okay, so we're going to hit the ground running with what do you wish Christians would stop apologizing for?
Everything.
Okay.
Everything. I think we as Christians in America have been so apologetic for being potentially offensive. And the same thing often gets carried over into the political world where I spend a lot of my time as a content creator, public speaking, on the news. We've been told for so long to be very polite, to always bow down to other people's feelings and always make sure everybody feels really good all the time. And I think that's a much broader issue in the Christian conversation in America today. It shouldn't feel good all the time to be a Christian or to spread the truth of the gospel in the world. Sometimes there's going to be a lot of friction there, and the gospel is very, very clear about what that looks like in Scripture. But we've always apologized whenever we say something that doesn't fit into the modern standards of the world, at least in my lifetime. And so I think ultimately what the future of the church has to look like if we're going to walk away from the direction culture is going towards and walk towards eternal life with Jesus Christ is to stand strong in the root of God's word and the root of understanding objective truth and being bold enough to share that with the world without apologizing.
Okay, so obviously this is called Unapologetic. So that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about, okay, what do we really shy away from? And it's, I mean, just scared to say anything. Yeah. You'll understand this as a speaker. I had just gotten off stage. It was like 2,000 people, and like your adrenaline's going, and you know, it's like, and so I got on social media, and I said something like, our generation doesn't even know if they're boys or girls. It's time that we start standing up. And I mean, like, not even like 2 years ago would that have been any kind of really absolute, like, wow, she's really taking a stand calling people boys and girls. And I got like dragged through the mud. I mean, it was
really?
And it was professing Christians. It wasn't a lot of people who weren't Christians. It was people who really saw me saying that as unloving to call us boys or girls and that God designed us, and really were confused. Like, they really were like, how can you say this? You're a Christian. Wow. Like, that was a lot of the argument. Like, you're supposed to love, so how could you be so unloving? And I just want to say this as a therapist. When I was in school, which was only about 5 years ago, or maybe 6, we were taught to treat gender dysphoria, that this was something that really hurts people and confuses them and can cause anxiety and depression and even suicide. And so that wasn't from a Christian's perspective. That was science. We've talked about your background in science. I mean, it was just the truth. Yeah. Like, it was known. This confuses people. This is obviously very upsetting to not know if you're a boy or a girl. And so it's something you need to help people walk through. And that was secular psychology, not Christian psychology. So I've even just had to think about things from that term. But having that experience of me not even saying anything that controversial and being dragged through the mud for it, I was like, we're just going to have a show called Unapologetic.
I love it.
So let's break it down. Let's talk about gender. Let's talk about just those really big things that we're apologizing for that we don't have to, because we didn't create this world. It's just how it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with gender.
I'll preface with, I am extremely unapologetic in the world that I work in. I kind of have to be out of necessity because I largely work in the political sphere where everything is offensive to everyone all the time. And there are real repercussions to saying these offensive things. I never anticipated that I would be here doing this job and that God would lead me down this path. I wanted to be a trauma surgeon and fix people when they got hurt. And that was ultimately my end goal from my academic experience. So I studied biomedical sciences in college and then got my degree in biomedical sciences, policy and advocacy, very long name, at Georgetown after college. And so was spending time as a young adult, you know, really coming into my adulthood on my college campus, studying what I thought was going to be the pursuit of objective truth. What I thought was going to be determining the difference between what we knew was correct and factual, what we had proven to be right, and what we had proven to be wrong. Things that for thousands of years in the human experience we've asked all the right questions about to come as close to objective truth as humanly possible. And I very quickly discovered that was not going to be my experience on my college campus, largely after the 2016 presidential election, when there was a total upheaval of what we understood to be truth to begin with. And I think that's a very common misconception Christians walk through right now, is that we still think the truth is the truth. In 2022, and especially for Generation Z, there is no such thing as the truth. There is my truth and your truth and their truth and his truth over there.
It's
and
truth.
everybody has moral relativism. So there is no such thing as objective truth anymore. When it comes to science, for me, that manifested in the weirdest ways possible. For example, spending months and months and months in my physiology class learning about every tiny miracle that has to go right for a baby to be fully developed in the womb, what that looks like when your heart starts beating, when your tiny fingernails grow, when babies can feel pain, only to be told at the end of that unit that abortion was probably something we would all have to practice as doctors, whether we wanted to or not, and that it wasn't ending a genetically unique human life. Even though we learned at the beginning of that conversation that it was a genetically unique human life. In one particular class, I think it was eukaryotic cellular biology, not exactly a controversial, not exactly a controversial subject to be engaged in. I actually had to choose against an answer choice on a multiple choice question that God created the universe. That was the wrong answer, and I would have been penalized for my grade when I was asked what the origins of the universe are. And a million other things. I mean, we talked about the First Amendment and a southern border wall in physics and organic chemistry. Why? Because that was the time I was going to college. And it became so controversial so quickly that even when I raised my hand to ask, hang on a second, I don't know if that's actually correct. I thought we were scientists trying to decipher the truth of the universe. I was immediately canceled on my college campus. And this was before cancel culture was a very common term. But as I started to lean into that, I started a Turning Point USA chapter, which is basically a conservative club on my campus. I got involved in student government. I started to really get involved in campus ministry. All of a sudden, I became public enemy number one at Colorado State University, was labeled every horrible name under the sun. Racist, homophobic, bigoted, anti-woman, and it was usually men telling me that I was anti-woman.
That's my favorite. That's
no uterus, no opinion, unless you're not leaning into that. Very bizarre. Nazi Barbie, white power Barbie, all of the above. It was absolutely horrible. And I was miserable for so long until I realized these people don't know anything about me. And ultimately, I'm here to be a student of the world, to ask all the right questions, to challenge my perspectives, to go after what I know to be true, which is what college is supposed to be all about. And I could spend hours talking about this, but you can read all about my experience on my college campus in my book, Frontlines. But I realized really early on, truth was not a virtue anymore in academia or in the real world, which I started to experience once I graduated. And ultimately, my job looks like a million different things now at 25, and I wear so many different hats. I'm an author, I host a podcast, I make TikTok videos, which is always very fun and exciting. But really, my job every day is to get up and tell the truth to a world that has rejected the very idea of objective truth. And that rubs people the wrong way an awful lot. So if I say something on this podcast episode that you go, ooh, I don't know if I resonate with that, just know I've probably heard it all before in terms of the backlash. And I think everybody, including you, Julia, is starting to experience what happens when you just barely touch the bumpers that this cancel culture society has started to put on the next generation. Gender is maybe the most controversial topic we walk with right now in 2022. And the idea that your chromosomes don't determine your biology, that don't determine your gender anymore, never used to be a controversial subject. Even when I graduated in 2019, that wasn't a controversial subject. And now it's 2022, and we're seeing this become my truth versus your truth, and that it's unloving to tell people, no, God very clearly created men and women for a reason, that we have different body structures and therefore different advantages for different things in life, that maybe we're supposed to fulfill different roles in society because of how our brains are wired and what we're naturally passionate about and want to run after. And that's not to say that men have to fall into one column and women have to fall into the other column, or that there aren't.
It just means those are the columns.
They just mean those columns exist, or that boys can't play with pink toys and girls can't play with blue toys. That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. But it quite literally does mean men cannot be women and women cannot be men. And me saying that right now means I probably would get deplatformed from Twitter. I have been deplatformed from TikTok twice with my account permanently deleted and then reinstated. One time for a video that got 5 million views explaining how periods work. Sorry if that's controversial, because a transgender woman, a man becoming a woman, had said they were experiencing their first PMS symptoms on Twitter. And I was explaining as a biologist, no, you're not. That's not exactly how that works. And very quickly had my entire account deleted for hate speech. So now we have labeled everything that is objective truth as hate speech because it could potentially offend someone in the future. And I think that's the real problem when we talk about a culture war. You may be familiar with that term if you're plugged into the political world. It's starting to come over a bit into the Christian media space as well. We talk about American culture being under attack and that we quite literally are in a war for the future of what our culture is going to look like. I think it's a lot bigger than that. I think this is not just a cultural war, but a spiritual war. And in our other interview about dating, we talked about kind of the Stranger Things concept, that there really are other dimensions and there are other things at play within our world because we live in a fallen, sinful world. And that is absolutely happening in real time as we see this very, very violent tug of war back and forth between what the future of America could look like if we continue leaning into this there is no truth concept, or if we dare to get up and tell the truth to a world that has rejected truth, which is exactly what we're called to do as Christians to begin with, what the consequences of that look like too.
So I've been looking at this and just thinking about, every time I see anything about transgender, this new stuff, I think about the verse in Romans, claiming to be wise, they became fools. Like, that's all I think of, because I'm like, it's interesting, even as someone, like, I accepted Christ when I was 5, grew up in church, my dad's an apologist, like, no scripture, and I've really been thinking about how can I make sure that I don't get desensitized to this. So even though, like, I'm sorry, I'm just not in danger of, like, believing any of this is true. I mean, I guess, like, everyone is if you stop believing truth. But, I mean, I'm committed to believing truth and believing God's truth. How easy it is for people just to become even desensitized to it. And you see this because whenever I was growing up, that was the big homosexuality discussion. And that's when I saw it go from this is a sin, this is even something that people go to therapy for, to this is completely accepted. And now, of course, we see it in churches, we see it with clergy, we see it all over the place. And I see Christians now who they would say it's wrong. They say scripture says it's wrong, but they are desensitized to it. Like, it's not that big of a deal. And so it seems like the new version of that is this transgender movement. And so how do you think just practically we can stay on guard and realize this is a war, this is a culture war, this is a spiritual war, and make sure we're not desensitized to it?
I think the easiest way is likely just to stay informed. And I think we get so overwhelmed by how crazy our world is that you just think, oh my gosh, I have to turn off the TV for 10 minutes and go outside and just not be plugged into all of this anymore. And you should. Please do not be constantly staring at the television or scrolling through your phone to be aware of what's going on in the world. But you cannot ignore and pull the rug over your eyes what is happening right in front of your face and what's happening to your children. Especially. I think about the fact that I graduated college just 2 years ago. I was very recently in high school and experiencing all of this, and this would have never been a discussion ever that would have come up in any of my classes. And now I'm looking at the news. I speak to a lot of college campuses and on high school campuses. I talk to friends that we grew up with, and I'm hearing stories like my next door neighbors at home whose 11-year-old came home from school the other day and said not one, but 2 of his classmates had said they were changing their gender or that they didn't have a gender. they were somehow in the middle, which is a whole nother conversation we could spend a lot of time on. I hear stories about fifth graders in Chicago public schools that quite literally by law now have to be provided free condoms in their classroom in fifth grade. So you're 9 or 10 years old, because that is progressive and that's loving and that's accepting for children in this generation. We hear about 5-year-olds whose teachers are trying to tell them your parents are working against you, and doctors and people that you should trust for your whole life, people that you're supposed to look to as the experts, are against you, and they assigned you, they oppressively put this thing on you, your gender, when you were born. But just because you have one body part or another doesn't mean you're a boy or a girl. You can change that at school and tell me, you can trust me, and we won't tell your mom and dad.
My word.
At 5 or 6 years old, all across this country, this isn't just happening in Los Angeles or New York City or Chicago, where you expect some of these things to happen. This is happening in Dallas, Texas. This is happening in Florida. This is happening everywhere. And so it's a really scary reality that because we were so overwhelmed by the crazy direction of society and we turned our back to it and we stopped looking, we've let it get this far. And I think now most Christians are waking up to that, and they're saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't say something earlier on, but now there's real consequences to me saying something. We talk about cancel culture kind of as a joke today, honestly, because it's so common, but cancel culture doesn't just mean you'll get kicked off Twitter or you maybe will have one friend who stops being your friend. Today, it could really mean you lose your career, you lose your practice in medicine, you lose your license to practice law in America, maybe you lose your access to your bank accounts. I mean, there are very real consequences to speaking the truth today, but I think the most important hope we can have is that there are strength in numbers, and you are not the only people feeling this way. The biggest lesson I've learned throughout my journey of using my voice with my career is that sometimes most people just need somebody else to be the first person. The first person to raise their hand and say something, the first person to post something on social media, the first person to go to the school board meeting and say, I am not okay with what you're teaching my child at school. There are a million ways to exercise that first person role. But once you do that, courage is contagious, and so many other people are going to stand up right alongside with you.
So I'm trying to figure out how to say this. I know plenty of Christians, maybe it's not they don't care, but they definitely feel powerless. Maybe they can't go to private school. Maybe they can't homeschool. Maybe they're not in a position where, I mean, they really are able to live on one income. I mean, there are situations where everyone isn't able to put their child in a protected situation. What can that parent do to really gain some kind of voice in what's going on?
Two things. First, I would say you always have options, especially for the education of your children. It has never been easier to homeschool your kids. And if you've never thought about that, or you have this image in your mind that homeschool kids are these weird homesteader, live on the farm people that you can't personally relate to, it is not like that in modern America today. For the vast majority of recent history and modern history, less than 5% of American households have homeschooled their children. In 2020, that skyrocketed largely because of COVID-19. And now by 2022, over 11% of American families are homeschooling their kids. It's a record that we've never seen before. And maybe that looks like a co-op. Churches often offer programs in your local area. There's a lot of online programs that help get your kids plugged in from their home to an education system that maybe you don't have to be personally responsible for every aspect of their curriculum. So there are so many options, tons of options that don't necessarily involve dropping your child off into the hands of people who do not have their best interests at heart. So be willing to explore that. You ultimately are supposed to be the guardrails of your children's experience growing up. That's not a bad thing. You're not supposed to be their friend. You're supposed to be their parent. And part of that is to help them be exposed to the reality of the world. But no, this world is not their home, and they have to be rooted in truth first. Which leads me to the second thing that most parents can do. Talk to your kids. Just get involved with these conversations. When I was growing up, I was raised by 2 Catholic lawyers. So we had a lot of conversation around the dinner table about politics and religion. We were always forced to watch the State of the Union and understand who was running for president and what they wanted to accomplish. And my parents were very conservative politically growing up and took the time to explain to my siblings and I, this is what we believe and why we believe it. But importantly, here's what the other side believes too and why we think that's wrong. But you have to make that choice for yourself. I was sharing with with the producer here that I did competitive speech and debate in high school. And that really gave me an opportunity as a teenager to do the research, to take the time and to understand the 360 degrees of any argument before I just blindly followed one particular path or another. I think parents today assume if I don't talk to my child about this subject, they just won't be exposed to it, and therefore there won't be a problem. They won't have to be sucked into thinking their gender was an oppressive assignment from a doctor. They won't be talked about by their teacher in 5th grade about sex at school. They won't understand what's happening on TV or on social media. And that is such a misguided misperception from most parents, because when you're not talking to your children are finding other outlets to find that information. And that could be through their friends, that could be through their teachers that many times you cannot trust in modern society, which is really sad because teaching is a very noble profession. Online, they're going through social media. There are so many different avenues, and therefore they're only being expected and exposed by the way of the world. And so they're not getting any sort of counter argument for that. It's uncomfortable and it's hard to have to sit your young child down. I mean, I can't even imagine that. I don't have kids. You have triplets. So I can imagine.
It was easy. You just say, we're boys and girls.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't used to be hard. I don't know, but I think about that now.
No.
I'm sure it's difficult to sit a child down and say, there are some people who say that that does not exist, and it's probably hard for a kid to wrap their head around that. But wouldn't you rather have a real conversation with your child about that at home? Give them the opportunity to ask all of the right questions, whether it's gender or any other controversial subject in America today, for that matter, rather than them having those conversations at school or with their friends or with somebody else that is going to tell them, no, there's only one way to approach this issue.
Right. And it was interesting whenever I was training to be a therapist, because this, I mean, like we've said, this is like the last 2 years. So this wasn't even on anyone's radar, but people would really want to know, like, how do you talk to your kids about hard things? Like, that was basically the question. And there was just a general principle from psychologists that you go with, like, their level of development. Like, you certainly don't want to introduce them to something that really is beyond their scope, because of course a 5-year-old should not know half of these things exist. Yeah. But that doesn't mean not talking at all about it. And you still are able to set those foundational beliefs so that then when they hear something else, they're able to automatically have alarms go off. Like, that's not what my parents taught me. And I didn't grow up with lawyers. I grew up with a pastor. And to me, I had to really understand for a while that teachers, I'm sorry, I just didn't understand how much teachers played in to a child's development. And you can call me crazy, but for me, I grew up in public school, and I went to school with the belief the teachers are not the authority. My parents are my authority. And so I heard all kinds of things that were incorrect, and I would go home and I would talk to my parents about it. And so I just want to say that to say, because some people are going to stay in public school, and it is a neat opportunity for you as parents to get to just have those conversations. But the thing is, like, my parents could answer my questions. Like, they were able to answer them, and I knew that it was a safe conversation I could have. But I wasn't personally thrown, and I got to have lots of standoffs with professors and teachers, but it didn't throw me because I had the foundation from my parents, from my church, for alarms to go off when I heard something that was wrong. And so I just want to say that to parents, because I think a lot of us I know are scared or feel fearful or powerless, and realizing, like, God has put you in their lives. Like, you are ultimately the one influencing them. And so those conversations just can be so life-changing, but making sure there's that safety of not, I mean, when they come home and ask questions, not being like, oh my goodness, why were you exposed to this? Or why did someone say this? Instead, making sure that they're getting to hear the truth from you. That's something I say to the kids all the time. I'm always going to tell you the truth.
And those alarm bells of, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you were exposed to that. Why is that happening? The answer is really simple. It's because we live in a fallen world. And scripturally, we believe as Christians that the world is only going to get crazier and crazier and crazier until Jesus comes back. And so we have to raise up the next generation with the strength to stand against that. And that's not only to say that these conversations should only exist in your home and between you and your child. I think so many people are worried about the lack of objective truth and these controversial conversations, so much so that they won't talk to their peers about it. They won't talk to their congregation about it. They're refusing to bring it up on social media or to talk to their family about it around the dinner table. And the reality is, the sad part about the world we live in today is that so many people are quite literally blind to what is actually happening right in front of their face. We know that to be biblically true, that people will be blind to the truth, that the truth will become lies and lies will become the truth in modern society. And ultimately that leads towards the return of Jesus Christ, which we all should be so excited about. But even self-proclaimed Christians, people that you walk with in your circles every day, are quite literally blind to the damage of the gender theory movement, to critical race theory, to the abortion conversation that's happening in America. And we have a calling as Christians, not just to get up and speak the truth and say this is wrong, but to do so in love. And I think that's where we get really scared, because we don't want to be canceled. We don't want to be seen as this evil authoritarian figure telling people how to live their lives or to encroach on their personal liberties. Those are always very important, and I will always stand for personal liberty. But we also have a responsibility to tell people when they are engaging in behavior or when our society is moving in a direction that's ultimately going to destroy their life. That's a very serious reality. It's not just something that'll make you sad for a few hours or something that's going to maybe impact your friendship here and there. We're talking about things that quite literally tear at the fabric of the human soul. And that is so, so hard to wrap our head around. And that's where that courage piece really comes into play. We have to be brave enough to speak the truth, but in love. And what do I mean by that? That maybe means embracing somebody who's experiencing gender dysphoria and saying, I see you, I understand what you're going through, or maybe I'm trying to understand what you're going through. Let's try to get you rooted in truth. Let's try to walk you towards the truth of Jesus Christ. Maybe that's embracing a woman who's experienced an unplanned pregnancy and an abortion, because that's very common. By the way, abortion statistics are exactly the same inside the church in America as they are outside the church in America. We don't like to talk about that as Christians, but it's true. And say, I cannot imagine the pain and anxiety and depression you must be going through. We are here to help you, and there's always redemption on the other side of that. You don't have to go through that same situation again. You don't have to be a repeat customer, the same way we talked about that with dating apps in our other episode. There could be a million other opportunities for you to reach people with where they're at, but we are called to go to those people. In politics, I often talk about this culture war, as I mentioned before, and I think there's an interesting schism happening right now in the conservative political side of things, where some people say, well, we have to stay the course, say the truth all the time, be up here on the pedestal and just let people know what we're doing, and they will ultimately have to come to us. I disagree with that approach very fundamentally, because I think it's our job to go to people, meet people where they are at, and then walk them towards this reality of truth, and ultimately standing for protection of their children or lower taxes and upholding personal liberty from a political side of the argument, but especially from a Christian side of the argument. Jesus Christ and the apostles didn't stand up there and say the truth and wait for people to come to them. They went to the evil people in society, to the tax collectors, to the prostitutes, to people that were literally being stoned to death for their crimes, and were brave enough to pick them up, tell them the truth, and walk them in the other direction. And I think we as Christians really have an obligation, not just an opportunity, to do that in the 2020s, be it gender theory or abortion or literally anything else in modern society.
Well, and even just evangelism. So we're just going to sit here and do our own thing and hope people come, or are we going to go after people that are headed to hell?
Literally.
I mean,
like we say that almost as a joke, but it's not. It's really serious.
Yeah. I mean, that's just even a conversation. I mean, you're talking about from a political standpoint, but it's a theological discussion of what role do we play in sharing the truth versus people who are going to be saved without that.
And that is actually the loving perspective to take, by the way. I think when we talk about we have to love people as Christians, that does not mean accepting them exactly where they are at. That's pushing the people that you love and that you care about to be the best version of themselves and to live in God's plan and in God's truth. That can be hard, and there can be a lot of friction with that sometimes, especially with very close relationships like spouses and friends. But that is what actual love looks like.
We just sum it up with the teenagers, because we talk about this a lot, and I mean it's difficult because they're like, well, I love this person. It's like, then you have to love them enough to tell them the truth. And the truth doesn't hurt people. It sets them free. And so I think I love, people love different things about the Bible. Some people just love the Old Testament. Good for you. I love how practical Scripture is. The fact that I can read something that was written thousands of years ago and it has to do with today in 2022 and helping people experience freedom and experience the life they were created to live. So I just want to encourage our listeners that the truth sets people free. Like we are not, it's not our truth. It's not conservative truth. It is the truth. And so that's a different kind of boldness that you can step into whenever you're realizing like, this isn't my idea. I didn't create people male and female. God did. And ultimately that does help people.
Yeah.
That helps them understand God's will for their life. But I love what you said just about realizing these things as someone who's spent their whole life in the church. These things are not just out there. Like these are things that Christian families experience, that people you sit next to in Sunday school experience, but they're less talked about. And so Ryan and I, we actually developed an entire curriculum for teenagers on what to do when you or someone else struggling with homosexuality, suicide, depression, anxiety, all these things, because there is the idea that even to get help, you have to go outside of the church, because a lot of churches aren't talking about homosexuality or transgender or depression or anxiety. So can you just like speak, we're closing, but can you just speak to why churches need to be involved in these issues and really confront them head on?
I read a poll the other day, and I know we were talking about this before we started recording, that the majority of Christian pastors in America don't consider themselves self-subscribed to a biblical worldview. That's
What does
a
that
really
mean?
scary reality if you understand what that means. That means biblical principles, what we know to be in the Word of God, the very foundation of our faith, are not being lived out by the people you go to a building every Sunday to hear about those things.
That's
And
great.
if that's not happening, it's probably not being shared with your congregation. And that's really scary. And I know everybody's probably thinking, oh my gosh, what do I do with that information? What you do with that information is you help lift up the people who are bold enough to share a biblical worldview. Maybe that means making sure that's happening at your church. Maybe that means following the right people on social media, great pastors who are putting stuff out there that you know to be rooted in the truth of God, and just encouraging your spiritual leaders in your life, be it your pastor or other leaders at your church, to be bold enough to take these issues head on. I think the biggest issue that is impacting the church in this way right now is the conversation on abortion, and that word alone is so controversial in 2022. I'm probably scaring somebody of you listening to this because I'm saying that
Not
actual
the people
word.
listening to this show.
Probably not. But it's interesting because, again, I was raised in the Catholic Church. That was the one issue that it didn't matter what party you were affiliated with. It didn't matter who was running for office. You brought your butt to the voting booth every single November to vote for pro-life people and pro-life causes, because the most fundamental human right given to us by God is the right to life. And Catholics used to universally believe that, as did many Christian denominations in America as well. Today, in the 2020s, almost the majority, 48% of Roman Catholics in America consider themselves to be pro-abortion. The vast majority of evangelical Christians in America consider themselves to be pro-abortion. And I have to wonder if it's because priests and pastors and ministers and people who have this opportunity to shepherd a flock of Christians are too scared to talk about it with the fear of offending someone. Because of that, 63 million children since 1973 are not here with us today. More than a third of my generation is not here with us today. And we know that they're in heaven, which is a beautiful promise, that they were innocent and they didn't have to suffer through the consequences of someone else's actions. But it's absolutely heartbreaking and devastating to me to think about what the world could have looked like if all of those children were here. And that really started with people being bold enough to tell the truth about one very, very big issue that is controversial but does require our leadership on that issue. The same could be said for the trans conversation in America today, that gender theory is taking over our education, our entertainment, every other aspect of society, and now the church. What are we going to do with that information to prevent people from literally making the decision that no life is better than the pain that they are experiencing on a day-by-day basis? The same can be said for substance abuse or alcoholism or pornography addiction or whatever that is normal in the world that we live in today by universal standards and statistical standards, but it's not normal in what we are called to be as Christians. So if you are a pastor or a church leader listening to this and you needed that little extra kick in the butt and that little extra encouragement to talk about these things, not just on Sunday morning, but all the time with your congregation, please take this as your sign, because I think it really has to start with those leaders being the first person to bring those things up and challenge the ministers and the pastors in your life to do that. If you're a member of a congregation and you're not seeing that happening in your own church, that boldness and that excitement and being on fire and having that passion for the truth of Christ is so contagious. I know I said that already earlier, but I really just want to hammer that home because you will not be the only one to stand up and say something. I think that's our fear, that we're going to be in the spotlight. Like it's like a bad dream and you wake up on stage at the high school talent show and you're in your underwear and everybody's laughing at you, that's somehow going to manifest and become real. That's not the case at all. People will be so inspired by that, and they will be bold enough to tell the truth to their children, to their friends, to their family, to their congregation, and other people all around our country.
It would take an entire episode for me to say how I've seen God protect my dad. And I could get emotional about it, but when you do the right thing, you're putting yourself in a place of protection. God honors that. Yeah. And it's unbelievable the people that come out against you, because they do. And even on an extremely high level, but just realizing when you are standing up for the truth of the gospel, God protects you. And it's just really amazing to see the things that happen whenever you stick up for truth versus what happens when you don't. And so I think we can be tempted to think, what difference can we make? We're just one person, we don't have a podcast, and we're not speaking at Turning Point. In closing, what can people do just to really make a difference in their sphere?
That's the most common question that I get all the time, especially from high schoolers and college students. And I always like to remind people, literally 3 years ago, I did not have a platform. I wasn't going on Fox News. I didn't have a big following on social media or a blue check mark next to my name. I certainly didn't have a podcast, or I wasn't public speaking for my job every day. I was just talking to people in my immediate community, people who lived in my dorm room, people who I sat with in the cafeteria at lunch, people I went to church with on Sundays, people who sat next to me in student government or in class. And I say to this day, the conversations I had when I first started walking towards this journey of being the first person to raise my hand and say something in class or challenge something I saw on my college campus, those were intimately more impactful with all of those people than any of the conversations I have now. I have a much bigger reach now, and I can talk to a lot more people on a daily basis now, but the conversion I saw in people's hearts when I very first started doing this, people who intimately knew me and sat with me in class or went to church with me or ate lunch with me every day, was astounding. And I'm talking about extreme conversions, people who believed in one world government and hated God and didn't think God was even real, all of a sudden going to church every Sunday and protecting our most basic liberties and rights. It was very, very impactful.
It's almost as if all this is real.
It is. It's totally real. Shocking, I know.
But it reminds you.
But that impact for you is the same thing.
Right.
Me and Julia and so many other people who post on social media will never know the people in your life. Maybe we will. Chances are, no, we won't.
Right.
We'll never sit with them at Thanksgiving. We'll never go to the movies with them. We'll never live in the same dorm building as them. Those people do that with you. And so you have an opportunity to reach people in such a more impactful way than anybody you follow on social media or who you see on TV. And that's why these conversations have never been more important than they are right now. Because if you're talking to your friend over a cup of coffee about what's happening with gender theory, that's going to give them a lot more opportunity to stop and think about how that impacts their life than something they're scrolling through and seeing on TikTok. If you, after church, meet up for lunch with your family friends and talk about how abortion might have impacted your life or somebody else, and how you want to walk away from that and tell people the truth, or maybe help someone you know who's experiencing an unplanned pregnancy, that is so much more impactful than any 15-second video I could make on Instagram or something that you see on Fox News as a really short sound bite or something small. So take the time to have those conversations and don't wait for somebody else to be that first person.
That is so good. Thank you for being on again. I am so excited about everything you're doing. So can you just real quick tell us how we can stay connected to Isabel?
Absolutely. You can follow me across social media platforms at the Isabel Brown, and listen to my podcast Outdated on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you can listen.
That's awesome. Thank you for being on today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in today to Unapologetic. Remember that you can hear today's episode and more at ptv.org/Julia and wherever you get your podcasts.